In 2024, China's National Energy Administration quietly updated a policy appendix that most analysts outside Beijing didn't read closely enough. It listed something simple: 200 hydrogen refueling stations already operational, with another 300 under construction, all tied into provincial transport grids. No press event, no global announcement, just a line in a planning document. At the same time, most European hydrogen pilots were still arguing over certification standards for green hydrogen imports, and the United States Department of Energy was funding demonstration corridors that, in many cases, still didn't have consistent supply chains feeding them. The contradiction is not subtle, it's structural. Hydrogen is often discussed as if it's a single technology problem: electrolyzers, storage, fuel cells. But that framing misses the actual constraint: industrial coordination at scale. And this is where the gap starts to open. China's hydrogen strategy is not a research program. It is embedded inside the same machinery that built its high-speed rail network, its solar manufacturing dominance, and its EV supply chain. Provincial mandates, state-backed financing, and vertically integrated industrial policy executed through firms like Sinopec and China National Petroleum Corporation, both of which have been retasked in part to act as hydrogen infrastructure anchors rather than just fossil fuel operators. The number that matters here is not capacity in gigawatts. It is deployment velocity. Between 2020 and 2024, China increased installed electrolyzer capacity from under 100 megawatts to well over 1.2 gigawatts, according to aggregated data from the International Energy Agency's hydrogen tracking reports. That is not just growth. That is an industrial scaling curve that looks closer to solar PV in the early 2010s than to anything happening in Europe or North America today. Meanwhile, in Germany, hydrogen backbone infrastructure is still in the planning phase. Pipelines approved on paper, but not yet physically repurposed at scale. The United States has announced regional hydrogen hubs, but most are still in early funding and permitting cycles, where timelines are measured in years, not deployment quarters. This is where the common narrative starts to break, because outside observers often assume China is catching up in hydrogen the way it once did in semiconductors or EVs. That assumption is outdated. In hydrogen, the competition is no longer about entry. It is about system maturity under coordination pressure. And that raises a more uncomfortable question that rarely gets asked in energy analysis. If two regions have similar access to electrolyzer technology, similar access to renewable electricity, and similar scientific understanding of hydrogen storage, why do their real-world deployment curves diverge so sharply? Part of the answer sits in institutions. Part of it sits in financing. But a growing part sits in something simpler: how fast industrial ecosystems can be retasked without waiting for market signals to stabilize. China is effectively testing whether hydrogen can be forced into existence as infrastructure first, demand second. The West is still testing whether demand will justify infrastructure. Those are not the same experiment. And somewhere inside that difference, the global hydrogen timeline is quietly splitting into two separate trajectories, even if the public conversation still treats it as one shared race. There is, however, an assumption embedded in all of this that deserves closer inspection, because scale on paper does not always translate into usable energy systems, especially not in a sector where storage losses, transport inefficiencies, and end-use conversion rates still make hydrogen economically fragile without subsidies. So the real question is not whether deployment is faster in China. It is whether speed, in this case, is actually solving the hardest constraint, or simply outrunning it. We'll come back to that. And what happens when speed itself becomes the strategy, not the outcome? There's a moment in most hydrogen discussions where the conversation quietly splits in two. Engineers talk about efficiency curves, policymakers talk about net zero targets, and industrial planners talk about something else entirely: whether the system can be made to behave on schedule. China's hydrogen build-out only makes sense if you look at it through that third lens. Take the so-called hydrogen highway corridors. On paper, they are simple: networks of refueling stations designed to support fuel cell trucks moving freight between industrial clusters. In practice, they are being built ahead of demand, not slightly ahead, materially ahead. In regions like Guangdong and Hebei, provincial authorities have bundled hydrogen stations, electrolyzer plants, and vehicle subsidies into a single procurement logic. That means a truck fleet doesn't adopt hydrogen first. Instead, hydrogen infrastructure arrives first, and fleets are nudged, sometimes aggressively, into using it. This is where firms like Sinopec become more than energy companies. They function as infrastructure accelerators. In some pilot zones, they are simultaneously refining oil, producing hydrogen via steam methane reforming, and scaling electrolyzer-based green hydrogen, not because those systems are economically clean, but because the transition path is being actively managed, not left to price signals. Now contrast that with the Western model. In the United States, hydrogen development has been structured around the concept of hubs, regional clusters meant to coordinate production and demand. The Department of Energy has allocated funding across multiple states, but each hub still depends on private sector alignment across utilities, transport companies, and industrial users who are, in most cases, still hedging their bets. Europe is even more constrained, not by ambition, but by fragmentation. The European Union can define hydrogen targets, but grid ownership, pipeline retrofitting rights, and permitting authority sit at national or even municipal levels. That introduces delay as a structural feature, not a temporary one. So when analysts compare progress, they are often comparing two fundamentally different systems. One is centralized coordination with rapid physical deployment. The other is distributed consensus with slower physical conversion. And that difference shows up in something very concrete: utilization rates. Several early European hydrogen refueling stations operate below 20 to 30% capacity utilization, according to industry audits from transport pilot programs. In China's bus and logistics corridors, utilization is higher, not necessarily because demand is stronger, but because supply and fleet deployment are being synchronized from the start. There is an uncomfortable implication here that rarely gets stated directly. Hydrogen is not just an energy carrier problem. It is a timing problem between infrastructure and behavior. Build too early and assets sit idle. Build too late and adoption never forms. Build in sync and you need a level of coordination that most market-based systems struggle to maintain without distortion. China's approach assumes that synchronization can be engineered. The West's approach assumes it must emerge. Both assumptions have historical precedent. Japan's post-war industrial policy also leaned heavily on synchronization. MITI directed coordination between steel, shipping, and automotive sectors. The United States, by contrast, historically relied on fragmented innovation ecosystems where failure was tolerated as part of discovery. Hydrogen sits awkwardly between those models. It is not purely an innovation problem anymore. The core technologies are largely known. Electrolysis is not new. Fuel cells are not new. Storage chemistry is improving, but not revolutionary. What is new is the question of whether an entire energy vector can be forced into existence through coordination alone. And this is where the time advantage claim becomes less clear-cut, because speed of construction does not automatically translate into efficiency of system design. Some early hydrogen deployments in China have already required retrofits, compression upgrades, pipeline adjustments, and station redesigns, because initial scaling prioritized deployment metrics over long-term optimization. That creates a subtle tension. The faster you build, the more likely you are to discover structural inefficiencies while the system is already in motion. Which leads to a quieter question that most policy documents avoid spelling out. Is China 3 years ahead in hydrogen, or 3 years deeper into a system whose inefficiencies are still being uncovered? We'll need to look at what happens when that infrastructure meets real energy markets at scale, and why the economics, not the engineering, may be the final constraint. At some point, hydrogen stops being an engineering discussion and becomes a pricing argument. That shift is already visible in global trade data, but it's easy to miss because it doesn't announce itself as a turning point. It shows up instead as something dull: contract revisions, revised cost curves, and quietly adjusted subsidy frameworks. The core problem is simple enough to state and difficult enough to solve. Hydrogen is still expensive to move and store compared to the energy it delivers. Green hydrogen, produced via electrolysis using renewable electricity, still sits, in most real-world deployments, somewhere between $3 and $6 per kilogram, depending on electricity prices and utilization rates. Gray hydrogen, produced from natural gas, remains significantly cheaper in most markets, often below $2 per kilogram. That gap is not closing quickly enough to be ignored. China's strategy partially bypasses this through scale integration. Instead of treating hydrogen as a globally traded commodity from day one, it is being locked into domestic industrial clusters: steel production in Hebei, ammonia production in Inner Mongolia, logistics corridors in coastal provinces. All of these become internal sinks for hydrogen consumption. This matters because transport is one of hydrogen's hidden cost multipliers. Moving hydrogen across borders introduces compression, liquefaction, or conversion into ammonia or liquid carriers, each step adding energy loss. So, by keeping early systems geographically tight, China reduces one of hydrogen's biggest structural weaknesses. But this creates a second-order issue. When a system is optimized for internal consumption loops rather than market exposure, price discovery becomes distorted. You don't immediately know whether the technology is economically competitive in an open market. You only know whether it is viable inside a managed ecosystem. This is where the comparison with Western hydrogen programs becomes more complicated. In the United States, projects linked to the regional hydrogen hubs often require private financing assumptions that force early exposure to market pricing. In Europe, carbon pricing through the emissions trading system is supposed to close the gap between fossil hydrogen and green hydrogen, but the price of carbon has been volatile enough that long-term investment decisions remain cautious. So both systems are trying to solve the same problem from opposite directions. One reduces market pressure to achieve deployment. The other increases market pressure to force efficiency. Neither approach is obviously wrong, but they produce very different kinds of uncertainty. There is also a technical constraint sitting underneath all of this that rarely gets enough attention in public discussions. Hydrogen is not just difficult to produce cheaply, it is difficult to use efficiently in end applications without redesigning those applications. Fuel cell trucks, for example, still face competition from battery electric alternatives whose efficiency advantage is difficult to ignore in short-haul logistics. In industrial heat, hydrogen competes directly with electrification in sectors where high-temperature processes are being incrementally decarbonized through different pathways. This means hydrogen's success is not determined in isolation. It depends on whether entire downstream industries choose to reorganize around it. And that brings us back to infrastructure speed. Because rapid deployment, like what is happening in parts of China, forces earlier decisions about end-use commitment. Once steel plants or logistics corridors are built around hydrogen assumptions, reversing course becomes expensive. But that also introduces a reversal risk. If those early commitments are made before global cost curves stabilize, then the system may lock in suboptimal pathways, not because the technology is wrong, but because the timing was aggressive. There is a precedent for this in energy history. Early biofuel mandates in the United States and Europe created rapid scale-up, but also locked in production pathways that later required policy correction when life cycle emissions were reevaluated. The infrastructure didn't fail, it just turned out to be more rigid than expected. Hydrogen could follow a similar trajectory, but at a larger industrial scale. So when people say 3 years ahead, it matters to ask, ahead in what exactly? Deployment? Possibly. Cost efficiency? Unclear. System optimization? Still evolving. And there is a quieter variable here that rarely enters forecasts: industrial patience. how long a system is willing to operate at suboptimal efficiency before economic correction forces redesign. That variable differs sharply between centrally coordinated systems and market-led ones, which leads to a reversal that doesn't get stated often in clean energy discussions. Speed can compress learning cycles, but it can also compress mistakes into infrastructure before they are fully understood. We're now at the point where those compressed decisions start to meet real-world energy economics. And the outcome is no longer just technical. It is financial, political, and structural at the same time. There's a point in every large-scale energy transition where optimism stops being a driver and starts becoming a liability. Hydrogen is entering that phase, not because the physics changed, not because electrolyzers suddenly stopped improving, but because the system is now large enough that small inefficiencies compound into macroeconomic consequences. China's hydrogen program sits right on that threshold. By 2025, multiple provincial governments have already embedded hydrogen into industrial planning documents that assume sustained subsidy support through the late 2020s. That matters because it shifts hydrogen from pilot technology into budgeted expectation. Once that happens, the question is no longer whether hydrogen works, it is whether the fiscal system can keep absorbing its cost structure. And this is where the earlier claim, 3 years ahead, starts to lose its clarity. Ahead compared to what metric? Deployment density? China likely leads. Industrial integration? In tightly controlled clusters, yes. Market efficiency? That's still unresolved. The problem is that these categories don't move together. In the United States, hydrogen development under the Department of Energy's Regional Hub framework is slower, but it is also more exposed to price discovery. Projects are being forced to reconcile with real capital costs, real energy input pricing, and real demand uncertainty. That slows everything down, but it also filters out weak configurations earlier. Europe is doing something different again. It is trying to force economics through carbon pricing while simultaneously managing energy security constraints after the restructuring of gas imports from Russia following the 2022 energy crisis. The result is a system where hydrogen is strategically important but financially fragile. So we end up with 3 different trajectories: one optimized for speed of physical build-out, one optimized for market correction pressure, one constrained by political and energy security fragmentation. None of them is a clean winner. There is a specific case that illustrates the tension clearly. In Inner Mongolia, hydrogen production tied to coal-to-chemicals transitions has been scaled alongside renewable electrolysis projects. On paper, this is diversification. In practice, it is a hybrid system where green hydrogen and carbon-intensive hydrogen coexist under the same policy umbrella. That creates a subtle ambiguity. Emissions reduction is happening, but not in a linear, fully decarbonized way. It is staged, layered, and politically managed, which leads to a harder question that policymakers avoid stating directly. Is hydrogen being deployed as a clean energy solution or as an industrial flexibility tool that keeps existing systems alive longer while transition pathways stabilize? Both interpretations can be true at the same time, and that duality is where most forecasts become fragile. Because hydrogen is not behaving like solar or wind, where cost curves clearly trend downward and deployment is mostly additive. Hydrogen behaves more like a system reconfiguration technology, one that forces changes across transport, heavy industry, and energy storage simultaneously. That makes timing everything. If you deploy too slowly, you miss industrial coordination advantages. If you deploy too quickly, you risk locking in inefficient architectures before global cost convergence stabilizes. This is where the earlier open loop resolves itself. Speed is not just a competitive advantage in hydrogen, it is also a form of exposure. Exposure to mispricing, exposure to infrastructure rigidity, exposure to policy commitments that become difficult to unwind. So when Beijing's program is described as 3 years ahead, the more precise interpretation might be this: it is not ahead in outcome, it is ahead in commitment density per unit of uncertainty. And that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Because systems that commit earlier don't just move faster, they also inherit the consequences of being wrong earlier. My opinion is simple here, and it goes against the clean narrative on both sides. China's hydrogen rollout is less about technological superiority and more about institutional willingness to absorb coordination risk at scale. That is powerful, but not free of cost. The doubt, and it is a serious one, is whether hydrogen's economic constraints will eventually force convergence anyway, regardless of deployment speed. Energy systems have a way of punishing timing errors over longer horizons, even if early numbers look impressive. The prediction is this: over the next 5 to 7 years, we will likely see convergence in hydrogen technology itself, but divergence in who has to restructure first. Countries that built fastest will spend more time retrofitting. Countries that moved slower will spend more time catching up. Neither position is cleanly advantageous, and that's the part most headlines miss. There is no final winner in hydrogen right now, only different kinds of exposure to the same constraint. If you look closely, the real competition was never about hydrogen at all. It was about which system can tolerate uncertainty without breaking its own assumptions first. And on that question, the answer is still being written, quietly, in infrastructure that most people won't notice until it starts mattering in energy prices they can actually feel. That's where I'll leave it.